There's a specific moment that changes everything. You're at a social gathering, surrounded by people, engaged in conversation, doing everything you're supposed to do. And suddenly, like a whisper cutting through noise, you feel it. The overwhelming desire to leave. Not because you're uncomfortable, not because something went wrong, but because every minute you stay feels like you're betraying something essential inside you. Something that's quietly suffocating while you perform the ritual of connection. And maybe you've felt this your entire life. This pull towards solitude that others don't seem to understand. This deep need for silence that people mistake for sadness. This preference for your own company that the world insists on calling loneliness. But you know it's not loneliness. It's something else entirely. Something the world has no language for because the world is terrified of it. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in psychology, understood this pull. He lived it. He spent years in what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, periods of deep solitude where he withdrew from the world to meet himself. And what he discovered during those years became the foundation of his most profound work. Because Jung understood that chosen solitude isn't isolation. It's not running away. It's the most courageous journey a person can take. The journey inward. The journey to meet the self that's been buried beneath layers of social conditioning, expectations, and the exhausting performance of being acceptable. Today, we're going to explore what Jung called the path of individuation, and why some people are called to walk it alone. Not because they're broken or antisocial or incapable of connection, but because they've heard something most people spend their entire lives drowning out, the voice of their own soul, asking to be known. And that knowing, that deep recognition of who you really are, beneath everything the world told you to be, can only happen in solitude. So if you've ever felt guilty for wanting to be alone, if you've ever wondered why silence feels more honest than most conversations, if you've ever chosen your own company over social obligation and felt both relieved and judged for it, stay with me, because what you're about to discover isn't just psychology, it's permission. Permission to honor what Jung knew was sacred, the deliberate, necessary, transformative choice to meet yourself in the only place that meeting can truly happen, in solitude. Let me tell you something Carl Jung understood that most people never will. Solitude and loneliness are not the same thing, and confusing them is one of the greatest psychological errors of modern life. Loneliness is a wound. It's the painful absence of connection you crave. It's feeling abandoned, unseen, unwanted. It's the ache of being alone when you desperately wish you weren't. But solitude, chosen solitude, is something completely different. It's not the absence of connection. It's the presence of self. It's the deliberate choice to withdraw from external noise, so you can finally hear what's been whispering inside you all along. Jung spent years studying what he called the individuation process. It's the psychological and spiritual journey of becoming who you truly are, of integrating all the scattered, suppressed, denied parts of yourself into a whole. And he discovered something that challenges everything society teaches us. Individuation cannot happen in constant company. It requires solitude, deep, sustained, chosen solitude. Because here's what most people don't understand. When you're always with others, always responding to external demands, always performing some version of yourself that makes you socially acceptable, you're not actually living. You're adapting. You're conforming. You're becoming what Jung called the persona, the mask you wear to navigate the world. And the more time you spend in that mask, the more you forget there's a face underneath. Think about your daily life. How much of it is spent responding to others? Messages, emails, social obligations, expectations. Even when you're physically alone, you're often mentally occupied with others. planning what you'll say, replaying what they said, worrying about how you're perceived. You're never truly alone because you've brought the whole world inside your head. But chosen solitude, what Jung practiced and what some people are instinctively drawn to, is different. It's creating space where no one else exists, where you're not performing, not adapting, not managing anyone's perception of you, where you can finally drop the mask and ask the question most people are terrified of: who am I when no one is watching? And that question, that's where individuation begins. Because you can't know yourself in a crowd. You can only know your persona, your adaptation, your mask. The real you, the self in Jung's terms, only emerges in silence, only reveals itself when external voices stop drowning it out. Jung wrote about his own periods of deep solitude, times when he withdrew from his professional life, from social obligations, to descend into what he called the unconscious. And during those times, he wasn't lonely. He was engaged in the most important work of his life, meeting parts of himself he'd never known, integrating shadows he'd been running from, discovering truths that could only be found in the absence of distraction. And here's what he understood that changes everything. People who are drawn to solitude aren't running from connection. They're running towards something most people never even know exists. The possibility of being whole. The possibility of knowing yourself so deeply that you're no longer dependent on external validation to tell you who you are. The first sign: you don't feel lonely when you're alone. Here's the first way you know your solitude is chosen, is sacred, is part of your individuation process. When you're alone, you don't ache with loneliness. You don't feel like something is missing. You feel relief, like you've finally come home to yourself. Jung understood that this is the mark of someone whose energy is primarily introverted, not in the social sense of being shy, but in the psychological sense of being oriented inward. Your psychic energy doesn't flow outward toward people and external stimulation. It flows inward, toward contemplation, reflection, the inner world. And when you honor that natural flow instead of fighting it, when you give yourself the solitude your psyche craves, you don't feel deprived. You feel nourished. Think about how you feel after a day alone. Not a day where you were stuck at home wishing you had plans, but a day where you chose to be alone, where you read, thought, created, simply existed without performing for anyone. Do you feel empty? Or do you feel full? Do you feel isolated? Or do you feel more connected to yourself than you've felt in weeks? People who don't understand this pattern think you're avoiding life. They worry about you. They tell you it's not healthy to spend so much time alone. But Jung would tell them they're projecting their own fear onto you. Because for them, solitude is terrifying. It means facing themselves. And they've spent their entire lives avoiding that confrontation. But you're different. You're not avoiding yourself. You're seeking yourself. And in that seeking, in that willingness to sit with your own thoughts, your own shadows, your own unfiltered presence, you're doing something most people never do. You're individuating. You're becoming real. The second sign: socializing feels like performance, not connection. Here's another pattern Jung identified. People drawn to deep solitude often find that most social interaction feels hollow. Not because they dislike people, but because they can see through the performance. They can sense when connection is real and when it's just two personas exchanging scripts. And once you've tasted authentic solitude, once you've met yourself without pretense, the superficiality of most social interaction becomes unbearable. Jung called this the burden of consciousness. Once you become aware of the masks people wear, including your own, you can't unsee it. And suddenly, parties feel exhausting. Small talk feels like violence against your soul. Social obligations feel like you're being asked to betray something sacred just to maintain appearances. Think about the last social event you attended. How much of it was real? How many conversations touched something true? How often did you feel seen, not as the persona you present, but as the person you actually are? And compare that to the time you spend alone. Which feels more honest? Which feels more like home? This doesn't mean you hate people. It means you value depth over breadth, quality over quantity. And you've realized that most of the world operates on the surface. Most people are content with personas meeting personas, never descending to the level where real connection happens. But you're not content with that. You'd rather be alone than settle for connections that don't touch your soul. Jung experienced this himself. He wrote about feeling deeply isolated even among colleagues and friends because he was operating at a depth most people never reach. And that isolation, painful as it sometimes was also the price of his individuation. Because you cannot become whole while staying on the surface. You cannot know yourself while performing constantly. And once you've gone deep, returning to shallow feels like drowning. The third sign. Solitude is where you do your most important work. Here's where Jung's concept of individuation becomes practical. People who are drawn to chosen solitude aren't just sitting in silence doing nothing. They're engaged in what Jung called inner work. They're processing, integrating, creating, thinking deeply, meeting their shadows, confronting their fears, discovering their truths. Jung believed that the most important work a human can do is psychological and spiritual integration, bringing the unconscious into consciousness, meeting the parts of yourself you've been taught to deny. And that work cannot happen in distraction. It requires solitude, sustained, protected, sacred solitude. Think about when your best ideas come, when you solve your deepest problems, when you have your most important realizations. It's rarely in conversation. It's rarely in crowds. It's in those quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts, when external voices stop and your inner voice finally has room to speak. Maybe you write. Maybe you create art. Maybe you simply think, walking alone, sitting in silence, letting your mind wander without agenda. But whatever form it takes, you know that your real work, the work that matters to your soul, happens in solitude. And protecting that solitude isn't selfish. It's essential. It's how you stay connected to the part of you that knows who you really are beneath all the noise. Jung spent years working in solitude. His Red Book, one of his most important works, came from a period of deep withdrawal where he descended into his own psyche and recorded what he found. That work couldn't have happened at parties. It couldn't have happened in constant company. It required the kind of sustained solitude most people are terrified of. And if you're someone who needs that kind of space, who knows that your soul does its most important work when you're alone, then honoring that need isn't isolation. It's individuation. It's the courageous choice to prioritize your inner development over social expectation. The fourth sign. You've discovered that most people drain you. Here's a truth. Jung understood that sounds harsh, but is simply honest. Not all connection is nourishing. Some people, even good people, drain your energy. Not because they're bad, but because the kind of connection they offer doesn't feed what you need. And once you've experienced the fullness of chosen solitude, you become acutely aware of who and what depletes you. Jung wrote about psychic energy, how introverts are drained by external interaction and recharged by solitude, while extroverts operate in reverse. But it's more than just introversion. It's about consciousness. When you're doing the work of individuation, when you're actively engaged in meeting yourself, you become sensitive to energy. You can feel when someone is pulling from you, when a conversation is costing more than it's giving, when a relationship requires you to abandon yourself just to maintain it. And here's where it gets difficult. Because the world tells you that choosing solitude over draining relationships makes you cold, selfish, antisocial. But Jung would ask, is it selfish to protect your soul? Is it antisocial to refuse to betray yourself for the comfort of others? Or is it the most honest, most courageous thing you can do? Think about the people in your life. How many of them see you, really see you? How many relationships allow you to be authentic versus requiring you to perform? And how do you feel after spending time with them? Energized or depleted? Because Jung believed that the people who truly matter, the ones worth keeping, are the ones who don't require you to abandon yourself, the ones who can meet you at depth, the ones who honor your need for solitude instead of taking it personally. And sometimes, individuation means letting go of relationships that no longer serve your development, not with cruelty, but with clarity, because you can't become whole while fragmenting yourself to fit into connections that require you to stay small. The fifth sign, you're not avoiding life, you're preparing for it. Here's the final truth Jung understood about chosen solitude. It's not an escape. It's not hiding. It's preparation. It's how you gather the strength, clarity, and authenticity needed to engage with life on your terms, not the world's terms. Jung called solitude a necessary descent. Like the hero's journey into the underworld, you have to go down, go inward, go alone before you can return transformed. And that transformation, that's what makes chosen solitude different from isolation. You're not withdrawing forever. You're withdrawing to become whole. So that when you do engage with the world, you're engaging as your authentic self, not as a fragmented persona desperate for approval. Think about what you're doing in your solitude. You're learning yourself. You're healing wounds. You're integrating shadows. You're discovering what you actually believe, want, value. You're becoming someone who doesn't need external validation because you've found internal truth. And that person, that individuated person, can engage with the world from a place of wholeness, not neediness. Jung lived this pattern. His periods of solitude weren't about avoiding his work in the world. They were about deepening it, about going to the source of his insights so he could return with wisdom worth sharing. And when he did engage, he engaged powerfully, authentically, from a centered place that could only come from having met himself in the depths. So if you're someone who chooses solitude, who protects your alone time like it's sacred, who would rather be by yourself than compromise your authenticity, you're not broken. You're not antisocial. You're individuating. You're on the hero's journey. And that journey, as Jung knew, must be walked alone before it can be shared with anyone worth sharing it with. So here we are, at the end of this exploration into the psychology of chosen solitude. And if you've recognized yourself in these patterns, if you felt that quiet confirmation that your need for solitude isn't a flaw but a calling, I want you to hear this clearly. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychological minds in history, spent significant portions of his life in deliberate solitude. And he didn't consider those periods his weakness. He considered them his greatest strength, because Jung understood what the modern world has forgotten. That individuation, becoming who you truly are, requires you to step away from the crowd, to stop performing, to stop adapting, to stop letting external voices drown out your internal truth. And that stepping away, that choice to be alone, is not avoidance. It's the most courageous thing you can do. The world will judge you for it. People will worry. They'll tell you it's not healthy. They'll try to pull you back into constant connection because your solitude threatens them. It reminds them of the confrontation they're avoiding. But Jung would tell you to honor what your soul knows. If you're drawn to solitude, if silence feels more honest than noise, if you do your most important work alone, then that's your path. And walking it doesn't make you less connected. It makes you more real. So stop apologizing for needing space. Stop feeling guilty for choosing yourself over social obligation. Stop pretending that constant connection is what you need when your soul is clearly asking for something else. Because the truth Jung discovered is this: you cannot know yourself in a crowd. You cannot integrate your shadows while performing. You cannot individuate without solitude. And yes, there will be lonely moments. Even chosen solitude has its difficult passages. Times when you wonder if you're making a mistake. Times when you question whether you're missing out. But Jung would remind you that loneliness is the price of consciousness, and that price is worth paying. Because the alternative is spending your entire life as someone else, never knowing who you actually are, never meeting the self that's been waiting in the silence all along. So embrace your solitude, protect it, honor it, not as an escape, but as the sacred work it is, the work of becoming whole, the work of meeting yourself without pretense, the work of individuating in a world that wants you to conform. Because at the end of your life, you won't regret the parties you missed. You'll regret the person you never became because you were too busy being acceptable. Jung chose solitude, and in that solitude, he discovered truths that changed psychology forever. He met his shadows. He integrated his contradictions. He became whole. And then, from that wholeness, he engaged with the world in ways that still resonate today. That's the power of chosen solitude. That's the gift of honoring your need to be alone. So, walk your path. Even if you walk it alone, especially if you walk it alone, because the journey inward is the only journey that matters. And you can't take anyone with you. You can only meet yourself. And then, if you choose, you can return and share what you found. But first, you have to be willing to go into the silence, to sit with yourself, to meet the person you've been avoiding by staying busy, staying social, staying distracted. That person, the one waiting in the solitude, is who you've been looking for all along. And they're worth the loneliness, they're worth the judgment, they're worth every moment of chosen solitude, because they're you, the real you, the whole you, the individuated you, and knowing them is the only thing that will ever truly satisfy your soul.